Tonight, we are forced to open with a shift in the economic landscape that trade experts feared would happen, that industry titans arrogantly waved off, and that our policymakers desperately tried to brace for but ultimately failed to grasp. We are witnessing a decision that didn't play out over months of careful, slow-moving treaties, but rather exploded over the course of a mere 72 hours. These were 72 hours that effectively fractured supply lines across 3 separate states. These were 72 hours that sent the value of automotive giants tumbling in freefall. And perhaps most significant for the history books, these were 72 hours that may have irrevocably transformed the way manufacturing exists in North America. The action Canada took today stepped over a line that Washington, in its immense hubris, simply assumed would never break. And when that line finally snapped, the American auto industry found itself with zero time to pivot. They were struck with absolute precision, with cold calculation, and with a devastating level of economic power. This represents the reality of what occurs when trade skirmishes escalate well beyond angry speeches. This is the reality of what happens when tariffs are met with direct retaliation. And this is exactly what happens when America's oldest, closest friend decides they are finished being pushed around. If you value deep dive analysis into the stories shaping our economy that the mainstream media often misses, please take a second right now to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to understand what's really happening. You might be glancing at the stock tickers or the breaking news banners and telling yourself this is just another petty argument over timber or dairy products, but you would be profoundly wrong. For the last year and a half, there have been warning flares, not from official podiums or press releases, and certainly not through standard diplomatic avenues, but flares nonetheless, signaling that Canada was readying a move without precedent. Canada has exercised patience, certainly, but that patience was always strategic. Historically, their pushback has been defined by restraint, by a predictable cadence, almost a deference to the American superpower. But what triggered the panic sirens in Washington this week was the sudden silence. The trade economists who track the pulse of cross-border commerce recognize these symptoms. The diplomatic backchannels suddenly freezing over, the abrupt cancellation of trade negotiators from the calendar, the quiet accumulation of agreements with alternative suppliers, and the sudden hushed coordination with partners in Europe and Asia. All of that chatter stopped, and whenever Canada goes silent on issues of trade, it implies that things are about to get incredibly loud. We need to stop and truly process what is being taken apart here. The reality is that most Americans do not comprehend just how deeply the economies of the United States and Canada are woven together. This goes far beyond friendly relations or a shared map. This is about survival. It is about economic existence. More than $400 billion worth of goods traverse that border every single year. The auto sector alone is responsible for nearly $100 billion of that total. You have parts made in Ontario that wind up in cars put together in Michigan. You have engines constructed in Ohio that are shipped to assembly lines in Quebec. This isn't trade in the way we usually think of it. This is one singular manufacturing organism that just happens to drape across an international boundary. And today, Canada threw a wrench into the gears of that organism, a massive, incredibly costly wrench. In the early hours of this morning, the Canadian Ministry of Finance unveiled what they termed a comprehensive tariff response package. This package included retaliatory duties on American automotive imports that we haven't seen utilized in over 8 decades. These are the specific types of financial weapons Canada only unlocks when they are sending a very particular message, that diplomacy is dead, that their patience has evaporated, or that economic combat is now on the table. The analysts didn't know if this fell into one of those categories or all 3 combined. But what they knew for a fact was that Canada was fundamentally altering its posture. And when the nation that shares the longest undefended border on Earth changes its economic stance without a warning shot, even by an inch, Washington notices. However, the tariffs revealed today were not inches, they were miles. We are looking at a 25% levy on American-made vehicles, 25% on automotive parts, and 25% on the steel components required to build those vehicles. And here is the detail that caught everyone flat-footed. An extra 15% surcharge applied to any vehicle containing parts that had previously benefited from U.S. government subsidies. That final clause is surgical precision. It is a direct hit on the Inflation Reduction Act. It is a direct hit on the CHIPS Act. It targets every single pillar of industrial policy that the Biden administration and now the current administration has utilized to try and overhaul American manufacturing. Canada effectively told the United States that if you intend to subsidize your way to industrial supremacy, you are going to pay a heavy toll at our border, and that toll will not be cheap. The statement that came out of the White House tonight was far from normal. It wasn't routine procedure, and it certainly wasn't just symbolic posturing. It was panicked urgency. Senior officials stepping out of emergency cabinet gatherings characterized Canada's maneuver as disproportionate, economically hostile, and perhaps most critical, strategically calculated to inflict the absolute maximum amount of pain on manufacturing in swing states. But we have to be honest with ourselves here. Strategic calculation is only effective if the target blinks or hesitates. Canada did not hesitate. In truth, the tariff package they dropped today was one of the most all-encompassing retaliatory strikes we have witnessed in the modern history of North American trade. Here's the data we have right now. Within a mere 6 hours of the news breaking, General Motors stock took an 11% dive. Ford put a freeze on production announcements regarding 2 separate plants in Michigan. Stellantis sent out an emergency memo to its supply network warning of immediate imminent disruptions. These were not small tweaks. These were crisis protocols, the specific playbooks that automakers only dust off when they are getting ready to eat billions of dollars in losses. The Canadian finance minister, addressing the world from Ottawa this afternoon, left no ambiguity about where her government stands. She stated, "Canada will not be bullied. Canada will not be threatened. And Canada will not accept a trading relationship that treats us as subordinate." Those words carry weight. That specific phrasing matters because, for generations, Canada has swallowed American trade dominance as simply the price of being neighbors. Today, they decided that price was too high. Tonight, the Canadian Department of Trade verified that this tariff package is specifically aiming at automotive supply chains, including assembly facilities in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, plants that had recently been expanded for what experts believe was intended to be electric vehicle production. Canada struck before the United States had a chance to reorganize those supply lines. They hammered General Motors, they hammered Ford, they hammered the budding EV battery supply network that was likely getting ready to cut out Canadian components. Put simply, Canada took aim at the future of American car manufacturing, targeting the exact infrastructure that was supposed to secure American dominance in the EV market. This explains why the White House reaction was so frantic. Canada's tariffs weren't just for show, they were actionable. They constituted the type of economic counterattack that could completely cripple American competitiveness if allowed to stand. And the administration, grasping this reality, responded with threats, not with strategy, not with diplomacy, but with pure reaction. They didn't put a negotiation on the table. They didn't suggest a compromise. Instead, they threatened more tariffs on Canadian lumber. They threatened to choke off Canadian energy imports. They threatened, and this is truly astute, to invoke national security provisions against America's closest military ally. This is not the way you solve a trade dispute. This is exactly how you pour gasoline on one. Let me be perfectly clear about the sequence of events here. The United States initiated this trade war. The United States was the first to levy tariffs. The United States claimed national security concerns regarding Canadian steel. Steel from Canada, our partner in NORAD, our partner in NATO, our partner in the defense of this continent, and now the United States is feigning surprise that Canada has hit back. This is economic policy being crafted by individuals who do not comprehend economics. This is trade policy being written by people who do not understand trade. And it is the American auto industry that is footing the bill. If you are finding this analysis helpful in cutting through the noise, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep bringing you these deep dives. And here is where the narrative gets even darker for those willing to look beyond the initial surprise. Economists are now convinced that Canada's retaliation was engineered to stress test the coherence of American trade policy following months of mixed messages from Washington. Canada wanted to determine if the United States was ready to negotiate like adults or if they would continue to escalate recklessly. Instead, they got the latter. Washington didn't offer a serious seat at the table. They fired back a response so hostile and so counterproductive that even Canada had to take note. You do not get Canada's attention easily. They are a patient people. They are diplomatic. They are measured. But today, the United States pushed them beyond the brink of that patience. Trade analysts speaking to Reuters off the record characterized Canada's pivot as a strategic decoupling, a method to slash economic reliance on a partner they can no longer trust. But Canada demonstrated today that they are still both capable of and willing to fight. Their tariffs were not just broad. They were calibrated with such precision that they target the maximum amount of political suffering in American swing states. That calibration is crucial because it reveals strategic intent. It proves that Canada is not some passive trading partner just nodding along to whatever terms Washington dictates. They are an active participant defending their economic survival, and they are doing it with lethal effectiveness. Just look at the geography of this pain. Michigan stands to lose 40,000 automotive jobs if these tariffs stick for 12 months. Ohio could bleed another 25,000 jobs. Indiana, 15,000. These aren't just abstract statistics on a spreadsheet. These are actual workers. These are families. These are entire communities that cast their votes based on promises of a manufacturing renaissance, and those promises are now crashing headfirst into the reality of trade war fallout. As the reports kept flooding in throughout the day, the scale of Canada's response became clearer, and the image forming is one of coordinated encirclement. Canadian customs officers started enforcing the new tariffs at the stroke of midnight, forcing American car makers to eat the cost hikes instantly. Canadian provincial governments took aim at American agricultural goods that had been winning market share over the last 6 months. Canadian trade negotiators working out of Brussels were reportedly synchronizing with European Union officials on parallel retaliatory strikes against American exports. This wasn't just a two-way retaliation. This wasn't just Canadian anger. This was a coordinated pushback. This was multilateral resistance. And multilateral resistance is the single obstacle American trade policy has failed to overcome since the days of the first Trump administration. For every tariff America has slapped on, trading partners have countered with something that multiplies the economic pain. Soybeans to China, bourbon to Europe, and now automobiles to Canada. The pattern is undeniable. The consequences are entirely predictable. And yet the policy marches on without change. Keep in mind, the United States assumed Canada would just swallow these tariffs in silence. They assumed Canada needed American markets too badly to put up a fight. They assumed Canada would value the relationship more than their own economic bottom line. But tonight, the exact opposite is unfolding. Canada is fighting back with precision and brute force. Canada is diversifying away from its dependence on America. Canada is constructing trade relationships that cut the United States out of the loop entirely. We saw this coming. I sounded the alarm on this exact scenario 18 months ago. When you treat your best allies like enemies, eventually they start behaving like enemies. When you slap tariffs on them, citing national security, targeting countries that share your own security infrastructure, eventually they stop sharing. When you repeatedly violate the rules of international trade, eventually the entire system collapses. That collapse is occurring right now, and the American auto industry is the first body on the pile. What makes this moment so volatile and so unstable is that Canada's retaliation struck at a moment when the American president is already under massive political strain. Republican hardliners are demanding more tariffs, not less. Manufacturing unions are demanding protectionism, not free trade. Wall Street is screaming for stability, not escalation. And American consumers just want affordable cars, not a 25% price hike. The administration is trying to juggle all these demands while bleeding support in the industrial Midwest. And when leaders in that corner are hit with sudden economic shocks, they don't respond from a place of strength. They respond from pressure. They respond from vulnerability. That is when the mistakes happen. That is when trade wars turn into shooting wars. That is when economic disputes mutate into geopolitical crises. We aren't at that cliff edge yet, but we are closer to it than we have been in decades. Canada is not Mexico. Canada is not China. Canada is the nation that shares NORAD. Canada is the nation that scrambled to defend American airspace after September 11th. Canada is the nation that has fought side by side with American soldiers in every major conflict since the First World War. And now Canada is the country slapping retaliatory tariffs on American cars. Think about that reality. Think about how catastrophically American trade policy had to fail to bring us to this specific point. The statement from the White House, now making its way through diplomatic cables, was intended to signal that the United States refuses to accept Canadian economic resistance. Officials stated plainly that Canada's tariff package was inconsistent with the spirit of North American partnership. That is diplomatic code for, we expected you to take our tariffs without hitting back. You don't usually hear that kind of tone coming from Washington unless something vital is on the line. And something vital is on the line. The entire integrated system of North American automotive manufacturing is on the line. Hundreds of thousands of jobs are on the line. Billions in investment capital are on the line. And the administration's answer is to threaten even more tariffs. This is not solving the problem. This is creating the problem. This is the economic equivalent of trying to fight a fire by dousing it in gasoline. Meanwhile, as Washington scrambled to cobble together a response that swung wildly between confusion and aggression, Canada's Prime Minister stood before Parliament tonight and delivered a speech that can only be called forceful and unapologetic. He stated quite clearly, Canada did not start this trade war, but Canada will finish it. He didn't stop there, declaring, we will not accept an economic relationship built on American dominance and Canadian submission. And perhaps most chilling for those in the White House who assumed this would be a quick diplomatic dust-up, he added, if the United States wants partnership, they know where to find us. If they want conflict, they will find us ready. You must realize that these aren't just rhetorical flourishes written for a quick soundbite. These are declarations from a government that fully grasps how high the stakes have risen. More importantly, these statements are crafted as much for the people at home as for the international audience. Canadians are furious. Canadians feel disrespected. Canadians are rallying behind their government in a way we haven't witnessed since the softwood lumber fights of the early 2000s, or maybe even the free trade battles of the late 80s. That public unity hands the Canadian government the most dangerous weapon in a democracy, political room to maneuver. It gives them the latitude to keep these tariffs in place indefinitely. And indefinitely is a very long time for the American auto industry to try and absorb 25% cost increases. When a polite neighbor stops being polite, you should be worried. When a divided neighbor becomes united against you, you should panic. Here is what makes the situation even more alarming for the long-term health of the U.S. economy. Canada's retaliation was not an isolated event, it was part of a sequence. Alongside the auto duties, Mexico also announced they are reviewing options to retaliate against American agricultural exports. The European Union hit the accelerator on their own counter tariffs on American goods. Japan ramped up scrutiny on American auto imports, specifically targeting safety compliance. All of this transpired within that same 72-hour window. You do not need a PhD in international relations to spot the pattern here. When America's trading partners start moving multiple pieces on the global chessboard simultaneously, it means something much larger is in motion. This is coordination. This is a collective response. This is the international trading system yelling enough. The United States has operated for years under the comfortable yet arrogant assumption that we are too big to be retaliated against, that we are too important, too central to the global economy to be touched. That assumption is being stress-tested right now. And so far, the assumption is failing. We are watching the weaponization of interdependence turned against the United States. For decades, we believed that knitting our economy into the world gave us leverage over others. We are now finding out that it also gave them leverage over us. The very mechanisms of global trade which we helped construct and which we assumed would always work in American favor are now being utilized to put a check on American unilateralism. Economists are currently weighing several possibilities, and none of them are particularly comforting for the American worker. One theory is that Canada is prepping for a total restructuring of North American trade relationships, a fundamental rewrite of the contract that has governed our continent's economy for a generation. Another is that Canada is trying to drag the United States back to the negotiating table using the blunt instrument of economic pain. A third possibility, the one keeping officials awake in the quiet hallways of the Treasury Department, is that Canada is attempting to construct a post-American trading bloc that cuts the United States out completely. We are talking about trade deals with Europe, trade deals with trans-Pacific nations, and trade deals with the United Kingdom post-Brexit. All of these are on the table, all of these options slash Canadian reliance on American markets. And consequently, all of these make future American leverage over Canada weaker, not stronger. But today, Canada took that reduction of leverage a step further. They didn't just threaten to find alternatives. They didn't just negotiate for alternatives. And they didn't just debate alternatives in academic papers. They imposed costs, real costs, immediate costs. And those costs are being felt right now, not in theoretical models, but on the ground in Detroit, in Toledo, in Indianapolis. The abstract theories of trade wars have suddenly morphed into very concrete realities for the shift worker who gets a call telling them not to come in on Monday. What we are watching now is a test of economic will, a game of chicken played with the livelihoods of millions. Canada wants to see if the United States will negotiate seriously or just keep escalating blindly. The United States wants to prove that tariffs are effective tools of pressure, clinging to a dogma that has rarely worked in the real world. American automakers want to stop permanent damage to supply chains that took decades to build, and American workers simply want to stop permanent damage to their paychecks. These objectives are not compatible. Something has to break. Someone has to blink. And right now, looking at the steely resolve coming out of Ottawa and the chaotic reactionary signals coming from Washington, Canada shows no signs of blinking. They have calculated the price. They have prepped their population. They have aligned their allies. We, on the other hand, look like we are making it up as we go. Tonight, we have heard from industry analysts who are tracking production line shutdowns across the Midwest. And the news is grim. They report that General Motors has already started the painful process of rerouting component orders away from Canadian suppliers, a logistical nightmare that usually takes months, now being attempted in hours. They report that Ford is actively hunting for emergency sourcing deals with manufacturers in Mexico and Asia, effectively looking for any port in this self-inflicted storm, and they confirmed that Canada's decision to slap these tariffs on immediately without the usual grace period is likely part of a pressure strategy designed to force rapid American concessions. But here is the reality we have to face. Washington is not conceding. In fact, Washington is doubling down. Their response today, hostile, reactive, and escalating, sent a message to Canada that the United States will not negotiate under the gun. But perhaps more devastatingly, it sent a message to American manufacturers that they are on their own. That is the tragedy of this moment. American workers are trapped between Canadian retaliation and American stubbornness. American factories are trapped between broken supply chains and political theatrics. American communities are trapped between economic facts and ideological trade policy. No one in Washington is thinking about those workers tonight. No one in Washington is thinking about those factories. No one in Washington is thinking about those communities. They are thinking about political positioning. They are thinking about mobilizing their base. They are thinking about everything except the economic fallout of their decisions. When the dust settles on a trade war, it is never the politicians who are left holding the broom. It is the machinist in Michigan, the assembly line worker in Ohio, and the logistics manager in Indiana who pay the price for a diplomat's pride. As the week unfolds, we expect more details to come out about what exactly Canada hoped to achieve with this gambit. But what we do know, even now, is that their tariff package was comprehensive. It targeted American weak points with precision, it coordinated with a broader international resistance, and it proved that Canada is no longer willing to accept one-sided trade relationships. What happens next depends entirely on what the United States does in the next 30 days. If they negotiate seriously, this moment will be remembered as the wake-up call that restored North American trade cooperation, a painful but necessary correction. But if they continue to escalate, Canada has already demonstrated they are prepared to sustain economic conflict indefinitely. They have shown they have alternatives, they have shown they have resolve, and they have shown they are ready to hit back. This brings us to a conclusion that many people in this country will find hard to swallow. Tonight, for the first time in decades, the United States appears to be losing a trade war. Ottawa is calm, Washington is in a panic, and when Washington panics, it means they are scrambling for options they should have considered months ago. Because tonight, Canada taught the United States a lesson they should have learned many times before, a lesson written in the history of every failed empire and every crumbled alliance. Trade wars have no winners. Tariffs are just taxes on your own consumers, and your closest allies can become your most effective adversaries when you treat them with contempt. We are going to be tracking this story as it develops, so make sure you are subscribed and have your notifications on. You won't want to miss the updates on this. This story is far from over, but the opening chapter has been written in red ink on the ledgers of American industry. Tonight, one thing is crystal clear. Canada is not backing down. The American auto industry is bleeding, and the only path forward is the path that should have been taken from the start: negotiation, partnership, and mutual respect. We have to ask ourselves, is the satisfaction of a tough-talking trade policy worth the deindustrialization of the Midwest? Is the appearance of strength worth the reality of economic weakness? I suspect the voters in those manufacturing states will have an answer sooner than Washington expects. We will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds. If you believe, as I do, that facts matter more than bluster and that institutions are fragile things that must be protected, I invite you to join us. Subscribe, engage, and help us keep thinking clearly about the politics, history, and institutions that shape our world. Thank you.